Okay. Now, as we said last week, this is not a definition of faith. It's a description of faith. And there's three words. We mentioned this last week. There's three words in these three chapters that summarize what true Bible faith is. One is substance. Number two is evidence. And number three is witness, which is in the King James is translated obtained a good report. So obtained a good report. So substance, evidence, and witness. The word evidence means conviction, meaning that it's the inward conviction from God that what He's promised He will perform. Witness, the definition of witness is substance. Substance means literally to stand under or to support. Stand under or to support. Evidence is a conviction that what God has promised He will perform. And witness or obtain a good report is an important word in Hebrews because this means that it's God. They have received God's divine approval on their lives. Faith, but if you have faith, it's evidence and it's conviction of substance and evidence, and by it you get a good report from God. God's divine approval. For faith, we said this last week too. Faith enables us to understand what God does. To understand what God does. Faith enables us to see what others cannot see. And faith enables us to do what others cannot do. Right? That's what we talked about last week as we started the chapter. Now, the rest of chapter 11, is devoted to a summary of the lives and activities and labors of great men and women of faith that are found in the Old Testament. Everybody who's mentioned in chapter 11 is an Old Testament person. And in each instance, you'll find the same elements of faith. And they are, one, that God spoke to them through His Word. Number two, their inner self, they were stirred internally in different ways. God spoke them through the Word. His Word stirred them to do something. And three, they obeyed God. And four, He, God, bore witness or had a good report of them. So the four elements that are going to be in every one of these people we talk about today is God spoke to them through His Word. They were stirred, they obeyed God, and He bore witness about them. So let's get started. We're going to start with the first one. Is in the fourth verse of Hebrews 11. Jeanette, would you read that? Now speak up so the people on the phone can hear you. Yes. Hebrews 11:4.
By faith, Abel brought God together all through the eternity. By faith, he was commanded as righteous. When God spoke well of his office, and by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead.
Okay, could you guys hear on the phone? Yes.
Yes.
Could you guys hear?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I assume okay, all right. So now the background story about Abel, we all know, is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 10. Abel offered a lamb. Cain offered something else. Cain got jealous, killed Abel, right? And Abel is the one that the writer of Hebrews said had faith, and it was by faith that Abel brought the better offering. So the indication is Abel was a righteous man because of faith. He was a righteous man because of faith. But today that when those of us who accepted Lord Jesus Christ, we do it by faith, and the Scriptures tell us we obtain the righteousness of Christ, right? Because of faith. Same thing. Abel was a righteous man because of faith. Abel obeyed God by faith. Now, we don't know exactly. I never said we don't know how Abel knew he needed to sacrifice a lamb. I mean, it's not doesn't say, but he did. He knew, right? Okay, and so he obeyed, right? Now, here's interesting. Abel's obedience cost his life, right? Abel obeyed, and it cost his life. Now, Cain was not a child of God because he did not have faith. Abel had faith, Cain did not. Now, think about it, but Cain did bring a sacrifice. So, Cain was religious, but not righteous. Okay? Because he did. He brought a sacrifice. He brought an offering, but he wasn't obedient. So he was religious. He went through the trappings, but he was not righteous. John, would you read verses 5 and 6 of Hebrews 11?
By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because everyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him.
Okay, so he identified Abel. Now he's identifying Enoch as a person of faith, a man of faith, a hero of faith. I call these people that are in Hebrews 11 like heroes of faith. So our faith in God grows as we fellowship with God. Because if we read the story of Enoch in Genesis 5:21 through 24, that's where we see the story about Enoch in Genesis 5:21 through 24. And what we find is, Johnny, can you go back real quick on Genesis 5? It's not many verses. 5:21 through 24.
If Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. And Methuselah had lived 100 years.
Okay, that's it. That's all. Okay, the verse 7 our faith in God grows as we fellowship with God. When it talks about Enoch, it talks about the fact that he walked with God. So for us, prayer, meditating on the Word, worship, fellowship, all of these things help us walk with God. Like Enoch walked with God, and in a world that was wicked, right? Because it talks about, Enoch was the father of Methuselah. Methuselah was the father of Noah. So we know scriptures tell us it was a wicked time, right? Because God said, "Hey, I'm done with these people," right? Okay. So Enoch walked with God in a wicked world before the flood came, and he was obviously able to keep his life pure, because Enoch was just taken to heaven. They never found him. He walked with God. So here's interesting. Abel took two things about faith, right? Enoch walked with God, right? He didn't die. Abel, who also had faith, died a violent death. So what that tells us is God has a different plan, different purpose for each one of us who trust in him. We all are not the same. God's plan is not the same, or God's purpose is not the same for all of us. His plan is that we're saved. Yes, that's all of us. But his plan for how we live our lives and how we go through our life is not the same, all of us. Enoch, that he made, he walked with God. Zip, he's gone. Abel obviously was righteous, but he died a violent death. All right, Jewel.
Yeah.
Read for me Hebrews 11:7.
By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things
11
not yet seen, because God was feared, formed an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith.
Okay. Did somebody else come on the line? Who was the last person? Huh?
Navasia.
Okay. Okay, now see, okay, I thought it was somebody. Okay, all right, got you. Okay, you just read Hebrews 7, and it's about Noah. The writer saying Noah, he identifies Noah as a person of faith. Now, we know Noah's story. It's if you want to read the whole story, it's in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. A long story because it talks about the flood and all that kind of stuff, right? And the thing about Noah's faith is that his faith involved the whole person, right? Okay, first of all, God warned him, right? Told him what was going to happen. He was moved by fear because God said, I'm going to destroy, everything. He was moved by fear, and then he acted on what God told him to do. God told him to build this ark. So he was warned, he was moved with fear, and he acted on what God told him. So what's real interesting about Noah now is that nobody had ever seen a flood, or maybe even no rain at this time. We read Genesis, it never talks about rain until Noah, because it talks about springs and water coming up from the ground, right? So Noah's action, obviously, you would think it's obvious, would have generated a lot of interest and maybe even some ridicule. He's building for something that doesn't even, we've never seen this, so why do this, right? So, but Noah heard God's word, and he was stirred, remember what he said, and he obeyed. Okay, now his story of him having faith is in Hebrews, so he obtained a good report, right? So Noah, the other thing about Noah is that Noah's faith obviously influenced his whole family, right? Because his wife and his sons and their wives went, and they were saved just as a result of Noah's faith. And what it says is that by his faith actually condemned the world because they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. Noah's faith actually condemned, what the word said. By his faith, he condemned the whole world, because, and he was declared righteous. He was righteous because he did what God said. He obeyed him. So and event actually proved he was right. I mean, they might have laughed at him, but he was proven right because it flooded everybody, and everything that walked on the earth was killed, died, right? Okay. Now, let's read. We're going to read a rather long section here. Let me break it up some. Sarah, would you read Hebrews 11, starting at verse 8, and read through 15?
By faith, Abraham, when he was called by God, obeyed by going to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went not knowing where he was going. By faith he lived as a foreigner in the promised land, as in a strange land, living in tents as nomads, with Isaac and Jacob, who were fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was waiting expectantly and confidently, looking forward to the city which has foundations, an external heavenly city, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive a child when she was long past the normal age for it, because she considered him who had given her the promise to be reliable and true to his word. So from one man, though he was physically as good as dead, were born as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand on the seashore. All these died in faith, guided and sustained by it, without receiving the tangible fulfillment of God's promise, only having anticipated them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Now those who say such things make it clear that they are looking for a country of their own. And if they had been thinking of that country from which they departed as their true home, they would have had a continuing opportunity to return.
Okay, so now let's see. Can you stop at 15 right there? Okay,
yes.
So now let's see if you would read Hebrews 11, 16 through 22.
Okay. But now they desire better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. By faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning these things to come. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones.
Okay, now the emphasis in this section is with what's called the patriarchs, starting Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So the patriarchs, these were the men in that the Hebrews really looked up to. They're like we look at the founding fathers of this nation. So the emphasis in this section is on the promise of God and his plans for the nation of Israel. That's the emphasis here. So the nation of Israel actually started with the call of Abraham. You know, God promised Abraham and Sarah a son, but they had to wait 25 years for the fulfillment of that promise. Then Isaac became the father of Jacob and Esau. And then it was Jacob who really built the nation through his 12 sons. Right, so he had 12 sons. And then Joseph is mentioned because he saved the nation while in the land of Egypt. And later on, Moses would deliver them. Moses is not mentioned here. We'll talk about him later in the chapter because he's very important. And what's important here is that waiting, because it talks in this section that these people waited for stuff that was a promise that never came, right? So waiting is hard, but faith, true faith, gives us the ability to wait for the fulfillment of God's purpose in his time. But while we're waiting, we still have to obey. All right? Abraham obeyed. He obeyed when he didn't even know where he was going. Jeanette. Is anybody else on the phone who can read or wants to read? Oh, Marlene. Read Hebrews 11, verses 8 through 10.
8 through 10.
Yes.
By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God.
Okay, so Abraham obeyed when he didn't know where he was going. Okay, and he obeyed when he didn't know how God's will would be accomplished either. So, morning, read verses 11 and 12 of 11.
Okay. By faith, Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child. And she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore.
Okay, so Abraham obeyed, one, when he didn't know where he was going, and number two, he really didn't know how God was going to pull off what he said he was going to do, because both he and Sarah were too old to have children, right? Yet, the scripture says they both believed that God would somehow do this, that God would do the miracle. So he obeyed when he didn't know where he was going. He obeyed when he didn't really know how God's will was going to be accomplished, and he obeyed God when Abraham believed and obeyed God when he did not know when God would fulfill his promises. Jeanette, read Hebrews 11:13 through 16.
All these people were still living by faith. When they died, they did not receive the same promise. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country home. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them.
Okay, so Abraham and the rest of the patriarchs, right, had no idea when God was going to fulfill his promise, yet they still obeyed. None of these people we read about saw the complete fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, that they were going to have peace, they were going to be in this land of promise. It told Abraham, where you walk, you're going to inherit it. The people went. None of these people we've read about saw this at all. They saw it. They saw it afar off, but they did not experience it. None of them experienced any of this. These people lived in tents. They knew that there was a place for them because God had said it. They believed God. And God always fulfills his promises to his believing people, but he might not do it immediately. He will do it ultimately, not necessarily immediately. And that's what these people were able to do because of their faith. They believed that God could do it, and they obeyed when he said do what they're supposed to do, because they were confident, they had faith in them, they were convinced that God was going to keep his promise at some point. They never doubted that would happen. Now, Abraham also obeyed when he didn't know why God was doing what he was doing. Johnny, read Hebrews 11:17 through 19.
By faith, Abraham, when God tempted him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son. Even though God had said to him, It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a matter of speaking, he had received Isaac back from death.
Okay, so Abraham obeyed when he really didn't know why God was doing what he's doing, right? Why would God want Abraham to sacrifice his son when it was the Lord who gave him the son when he and Sarah was old? So all of the promises that God made to Abraham were wrapped up in Isaac, because at one point in time, Abraham said, "Thank you for Ishmael," and God said, "No. I promised that you and Sarah are going to have a child, and that's who." And I paraphrase, that's who the promises are going to come through, right? So all of the future promises are wrapped up in Isaac. The Lord says, "Sacrifice Isaac." Abraham obeyed, even though it was difficult. We have tests of faith sometimes that are difficult when we're walking with God. However, the rewards are fantastic if we obey. So think about the faith of Abraham. Also, though the writer doesn't mention it here, but think about the obedient faith of Isaac. When you go back and read the story, Isaac carried the wood, right, was for the sacrifice. He didn't see no sacrifice, right? He didn't see nothing. Isaac at this time was not a little child. They think he was at least a teenager. There have been as many as 30 years, but at least a teenager. He did not fight. The scripture says he did not fight when Abraham put him down on the altar to sacrifice it. So Isaac obviously had obedient faith. All right? And we're kind of looking at with Isaac's imagination, but you think when you read the story, Isaac apparently had faith enough to believe, at least believe that what his father was doing was something God wanted him to do. Okay, right? All right. Now, Jules, would you read Hebrews 11:20-22?
By faith, Isaac left Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, who was dying, gave mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. Okay, so in Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, we've got 4 generations of faith. 4 generations of faith. Now, these men were not perfect. If we read the whole stories, we find that none of these men were not perfect. They failed sometimes, right? But they were men of faith. They were devoted to God. They trusted Him. They believed Him. Abraham passed the promises on to Isaac. Isaac passed the promises and the blessings along to Jacob. And he blessed Esau and Jacob, but the promise that was made to Abraham was the one he blessed Jacob with. And Jacob then shared them with his 12 sons. Now you can find it, if you read the Genesis chapter 48 and 49, you'll see where Jacob then blesses each one of his sons with specific blessings. And if you through history, if you go look at the history after that, all of this stuff happened. So Jacob actually, but because he had faith, God would do what He said He would do. He actually blessed each of his sons. So Abraham blessed Isaac. Isaac blessed passed the promises and the blessings on to Jacob, and then Jacob to his 12 sons. Now Joseph's faith actually was pretty remarkable. After the way his family treated him, you would think he might have abandoned his faith, right? But he actually grew stronger from that. You remember his brothers threw him in a pit. And then after that,
after he was in Egypt, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He was in prison. When the prisoners got out, they interpreted him, they forgot about him. And then, right? So that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot. So even all of that did not weaken Joseph's trust in God. He knew what he believed. He knew what God had promised, and he knew that God was going to deliver his people from Egypt because he knew what the promise was. So he actually made them promise, whenever you leave, take my bone. Sarah, would you go to Genesis chapter 50 and read verses 24 and 25?
50, you said, right?
Yes, 50, 24, and 25.
Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up out of this land to the land which he promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give to you. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel, Jacob, swear an oath, saying, God will surely visit you and take care of you, returning you to Canaan, and when that happens, you shall carry my bones up from here.
Okay, so Joseph knew he belonged in Canaan and not Egypt because of the promise God had made in his faith. So he wanted them to promise to take his bones, and they did. Sarah, since you're close to Exodus, read Exodus chapter 13, verse 19.
Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had solemnly ordered, placed under an oath, the Israelites, saying, God will surely take care of you, and you must carry my bones away from here with you.
Okay, so they took them, and then when they got there, what did they do? Sarah, go to Joshua chapter 24, verse 32.
I'm sorry. What chapter?
Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32. Oh, I'm sorry. That can't be true. Yes, 24, 32.
Now they buried the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the plot of land which Jacob had brought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and it became the inheritance of the sons of Joseph.
Okay, so Joseph believed the promise that God made to Abraham was passed down. So he said, take my bones up, and they did. Okay? Now, so we really have to admire all of these people because they did not have a Bible like we do. Right? They didn't have that. Yet their faith was strong because there was the promises that were passed on, and they believed God. So they handed God's promises down from generation to generation. In spite of the fact that these were not perfect people, they messed up a lot of times. They were tested. They had faith, and the result of that faith, remember we said they obtained a good report. And all these, they believed God, and he bore witness to their faith because they're there in Hebrews. The testament of their faith is there in Hebrews. All right? So now let's talk about Moses. Moses is very important, and we've got to look at his faith too. Nabasia. Go to Hebrews 11. Verses 23 through 29.
By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer afflictions with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned.
Okay, so thanks. Okay, so now first of all, Moses' parents obviously had faith, right? So he's very fortunate he had believing parents. They were, because they knew that there was something about this child, and they knew the promises too. There's something about this child that they hid him. They hid the child, and that's in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 is the story about what happened to Moses, and hidden, and his mom actually nursed him. That's the Pharaoh's daughter found him, so on. So, but go back and read that if you want to. We know the story. But Moses' parents obviously had faith. Now, there's three great things relating to faith that we can see in the life of Moses. Marlene, read Hebrews 11, 24, and 25.
Okay. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin.
Okay, so first of all, Moses, with 24 and 25. First, Moses' faith, okay, the theme in those verses is that his faith allowed him to refuse something. Okay? The refusal of faith. His faith allowed him to refuse all the easy life he could have had in the palace. Right? His faith is what moved him to refuse this kind of life. Remember now, he was raised by his mother, right, who took care of him for Pharaoh's daughter. So she obviously told him about his people, right? The reason we know that is because when he got old, he killed the Egyptians because it was right. So he knew his people. It wasn't that he didn't know his people, right? So his faith allowed him to refuse to accept that kind of life. He chose identity with a bunch of slaves, his people, right? So the point for us is true faith causes us to hold on to right values and make right decisions. Faith will allow us, give us the ability to make the right choices. And when he talks about that he chose to be mistreated rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, he's not talking about just lust. He's talking about the whole lifestyle, right? The phrase actually describes a way of life that today we call successful. He could have appeared to be successful, but he made the right choice because of his faith and identifying with his people. He could have had prestige, he could have had power, he could have had wealth, he could have had freedom from problems. Just think of that. He could have a really harsh life, right? But his faith enabled him to refuse that kind of life for obedience to God. Remember, obedience is very important. Obedience. Know the word, obey it, right? So know the word, then we got to obey it. It's one thing to know it, and it's quite another thing to not obey it. Faith is what allows us to enable us to obey it. Another thing you just read, right? Morning. Read Hebrews 11. Who just read? I've lost track.
I did.
Anyway, Marlene, read chapter 11, verse 26.
Chapter 11, 26. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward.
Okay,
26
so one, just 26, just one verse. So one, his faith allowed him to refuse, right? It's called the refusal of faith. The next is the reproach of faith. He was willing, right, to take on the reproach of faith, being identified with the slaves for the sake as greater value than the riches of Egypt. Right? He regarded the reproach. He took the disgrace of being a slave of greater value than the riches of Egypt. And his faith is what allowed him, enabled him to do that. Right? He left the palace, and he never went back to that old life. Once he left, he never went back to that. Right? He identified himself with the slaves, and so one thing for us today is that sometimes we have to bear reproach and suffering because of our faith. It's our faith that enables us to do that. And we thank God we don't have to kind of suffer the same kind of reproach that the apostles did. You remember, we don't have to torture and suffering and death. There are places though in this world today where being a Christian you suffer a lot of reproach.
Yeah.
And it's the faith of those people that enable them to do that. We described what faith is, and it's an inner thing. It's something we can't do ourselves. We have to be. It's a gift that God gives us, enabled us when we receive the Holy Spirit, that enables us to do that. It's a faith in the promises of God. The faith we're convinced that what God said He would do, He will do. Right? We're convinced of that. Let's see. Jeanette, read Hebrews 11:26 through 29.
It is what regarded this grace, the faith of Christ, as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt. Because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the application of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel.
One more verse.
By faith people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land. But when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned.
Okay, so now the three things I said. Three things was one, Moses' faith enabled him to refuse, right? His faith enables him to accept reproach. And the third theme and finally is the reward of faith, right? God always rewards through faith. If not immediately, ultimately. Right? God always rewards through faith. It may not be immediate, but it's going to do it. Moses' faith enabled him, and you know the story about Moses. Moses was not crazy about doing what God said to do, right? But Moses' faith enabled him to face Pharaoh unafraid and to trust God to deal with Pharaoh. And this is not a natural thing for Moses, because Moses, as we know, was hesitant and afraid. It wasn't a natural thing for him. It was his faith that allowed him to do that. And the reward was they got out of Egypt. The reward was they were released. The reward was they went through the Red Sea. The reward was he ever released. That was the reward of his faith.
But I was glad why you didn't get to go into the promise?
Yeah, remember what I said? When I said the way you get you finally get the reward of faith is you obey, right? And there was a point in time where Moses took credit rather than God. The story is, remember, the people were complaining about water, right? God said to Moses, "Go over to the rock and say, and do it, not hit the rock, but and water will come from the rock." And acknowledge God. Now, there's other stories in Exodus before that where water comes from rock before, right? Moses goes over, he prays, and water comes. Right? This time, because he's angry, we have to kind of watch it. Because Moses is angry with the people, he goes and bangs on the rock and says, essentially, okay, you want water? Here, I'll give you water. Bang, he hits on it, and water comes out. So he disobeyed God, and he's taking credit rather than God. So God said, okay, sorry, Moses, you can't go in. This is chapter 12 of Hebrews. It talks about discipline. So we're
it's kind of hard, don't you think? It's kind of hard to look at all that he went through.
Yeah.
All the things he did wrong.
Yep.
And then that one little thing he got to,
I do think it's harsh. However, I'm not God, right? Okay, and he didn't do what God said. But however, the ultimate reward is not just Canaan. The ultimate reward is two things. One, Moses is lifted up in the Bible as a man of God, right? He's listed as a hero of the faith in here. Here's one thing. Remember this. Of all of this stuff we've read, right, we know that all of these people were not perfect. We know that they did some stuff bad. But in the account in Hebrews, never is the bad stuff mentioned. You look at Hebrews, all these people, it's only their faith. It's only their faith. If you look at Hebrews, it's only their faith. It doesn't talk about their failings. Right? And we do know that they failed in a bunch of places, right, at times. All right? But it was harsh. But the final reward, remember what I said, God does his promises not immediately but ultimately. And so Moses went with God. Remember Moses was with Jesus on the Mount Transfiguration. So Moses received his reward. He didn't go to Canaan. He couldn't get in there. But he received his reward. What is the reward of faith? God always rewards through faith. And so the faith, here's how Moses' faith was rewarded. He was rewarded with deliverance of him and his people. They got out of Egypt, right? That story, is in Exodus chapters 11 through 13, that whole story. And in that 11 through 13, it talks about the Passover. The Passover is mentioned in Hebrews. It talks about the Passover and what in Exodus describes what they were to do during the Passover. And so you had to obey what God said. Again, it's faith in order for the death angel to pass over the house and for you to get out of Egypt. So it's by faith. Sarah, read verse 28 of Hebrews 11.
By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkling of the blood on the doorposts, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch them, the firstborn of Israel.
Okay, all right. So faith by faith, they kept what takes us through. There's an example of that with the Red Sea, right? Read verse 29 of Hebrews 11, Sarah.
By faith, the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. But when the Egyptians attempted it, they were drowned.
Okay, so the faith, there's a reward that faith takes us through, and that faith brings us in, and there's an example of that in verse 30 of Hebrews 11, Sarah.
By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days by Joshua and the sons of Israel.
Oh, okay. All right. So when we trust God, right, we get the benefit of what God can do. When we trust God, we get the benefit of what God can do. When we trust ourselves, we only get what weak people can do. Moses is an example. Moses trusted himself when he hit the rock, right? You know what the result of that was, right? But Moses is also an example of what true biblical faith means. Is obeying God in spite of the circumstances, and using the fact that he didn't get into Canaan and the consequences. So faith, true biblical faith means obeying God in spite of the circumstances and the consequences. But sometimes obeying God, the consequences are not great in our opinion, right? They are good things, but as far as we can see and other people can see, they're not good. There were bad consequences. All right? So we've got a little more time. Jeanette, would you read verses 30 and 31, 30 again, and then 31 Hebrews 11. We're talking about Joshua and Rahab now.
I faced the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around me for 7 days. I faced the prostitute Rahab because she walked with pride, not killed with those who were disobedient.
Okay, so faith enables us to win, right? Faith enables us to win. The conquest of Jericho is in Joshua chapters 2 through 6. You know, Joshua was Moses' successor. Moses couldn't go in. Joshua was Moses' successor, and the reason he succeeded is because the same reason that Moses did. He trusted God, he had faith, and he believed God. Point is, God can change his workers, right? But he doesn't change his method of operation, which is faith, right? He can change his people and does, but he doesn't change his method of operation. He blesses faith, right? And he judges unbelief. God blesses faith, he judges unbelief. So Joshua's first act of faith was not the defeat of Jericho. Joshua's first act of faith was similar to something Moses did. Joshua's first act of faith was crossing the Jordan River. God did, when they entered Canaan, something similar to what he did when they left Egypt. The Jordan. Let's go to Johnny. Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. Right.
So when people go camp across the Jordan, the priests carrying the ark of the covenant went ahead of them. Now the Jordan is a flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carry the ark reached the Jordan, and their feet touched the water's edge. The water from the upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarephath, while the water flowing down to the sea of the Elbath, that is, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priest who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on the dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry land.
Okay, so very similar to the Red Sea, right? They crossed over the Jordan on dry land just like they did the Red Sea. So that was the commentator that I'm using for this said that was Joshua's first act of faith. I don't believe that was so. I believe Joshua's, in my opinion, Joshua's first act of faith was his report when he came back from the spies in Canaan. Remember, he came back to the 12, and only he and Caleb said we can take it. So I believe that, I believe that was Joshua's first act of faith. This guy says this was his first act of faith. But maybe this was his first act of faith in becoming, I guess, after succeeding Moses, I guess. Okay. But okay. So any questions? We're gonna have to end there today. But we'll be able to finish 11 and get into 12 next week. Any questions or comments? Okay. Yeah, this is a great chapter. We'll talk about faith. Right. Okay. Any other comments before we or questions? Okay. Prayer request.
My friend, his sister has COVID, and she's not doing too good. And her name is Raina.
Okay. Anybody else? Did you hear that on the phone?